Hey students, this is another one of our evolution videos in a series of video tutorials about evolution. And in this short video, I want to explain to you some of the evidence that we have, that scientists have, that supports the theory of biological evolution. For example, here we see some skulls of what we believe to be ancient humans, along with a skull right over here on the right-hand side, which is a skull of a modern human. And the theory is that humans evolved over time, and that the shape of our skulls and the shapes of our bodies, for example, changed over time. But it's not enough just to have the skulls here, the fossils, to go from. You have to have other information to put together this theory. So let's think about human evolution in this tutorial, but also the evolution of other organisms as well. So one common question that scientists usually ponder, and other people ponder as well when we think about evolution, is this question about whales. How did whales evolve? There's kind of two main explanations, I guess, that people kind of come up with, which is, did whales evolve from fish? Because they're in the ocean, of course, and they kind of look like fish and they swim like fish, okay? Or did whales evolve from other mammals? Because we know whales are mammals, and really the only other mammals are the ones that are on land. If you kind of group whales and porpoises and dolphins kind of into one category of marine mammals, you have some other things like manatees and things like that. But other than that, most of the mammals we know of on Earth are land mammals. And so that's kind of a puzzling thing because, again, these mammals, the whales here, are in the ocean, and most of the other mammals are on land. So that disrupts a little bit of the sequence of how that evolution could have occurred. And of course, the current theory is this one right here, which is that whales evolved from land mammals. And if we look at the evidence, this is the conclusion that we come to. There was, we believe, we have evidence that there was an ancient mammal of some kind, the Elomyrix, something like that. And then over time, that creature, that species, contained some variation that allowed it to evolve or change over time, and we're talking like long periods of time here, remember, into something that may have swam a little bit, and then something like Rhodocetus here, which had definitive swimming and aquatic characteristics, and then something like Dorudon, which is an ancient whale species that clearly has the form and function of modern day whales. And so we have evidence that suggests that this is the way that it happened. But what is that evidence? What evidence do we have for that series of events, which seems to some people a little bit unlikely, or at least a process that would require a very specific time frame and a very specific set of events? So let's take a look at some of the evidence that we have for things like this. The first evidence we have, of course, is fossils. The evolution of almost any organism on Earth that we have a fossil for, this is the evidence that supports the theory of biological evolution. A lot of the fossils we see are different in form and function than the bone, example, structure that we have for whales, for modern day whales. This is a fossil you see here of an ancient whale type organism. And it's different than what we have for bone structure and anatomy of current whales. And so we have evidence that things have changed, assuming that this fossil and a modern day whale, for example, are in fact connected through biology. The next thing here is, of course, that fossils are found in layers of rock. And so fossils being our first main line of evidence for biological evolution, we have rocks that are older and rocks that are younger. And that's a sort of a generally accepted geological principle that the older rock layers are lower than the younger rock layers. And they're not always very nicely horizontal and stratified like this. But depending on where we find the fossils, we can place them in time. And so we can actually place the form of the bones or the shell structure or whatever was fossilized, we can place those changes in chronological order through time. And so we get not only fossils that we know occurred in the past, we know exactly, or sort of in relative sense, when they occurred in the past. So we get even more information from our geology. And of course, the main thing that fossils show us is just physical characteristics, or in this case, physical similarity between a modern day whale. The bones you see here in the upper right-hand corner are of a fairly recent whale ancestor. And for example, the one right below is a more distant whale ancestor. And so by comparing these things, we can get a picture of some of the changes and how they may have happened over time. And here is sort of an artist's rendition of what we know about some of the skulls and bones that we found in that we think are related to whales. You have the modern whale down here at the bottom, and then here's that Durodon, again, that ancient whale form. Rhodocetus having, again, more of those limbs, like a four-legged mammal that would live on land. And then Pakicetus, we have fossil evidence that suggests that the bone structure and the skull structure are all very similar, and that this sort of series of events of this organism changing into this organism over time, and then finally into modern day whales, could have happened. Here's a look at the skulls over here on the right hand side, the migrating of the nostrils from the front of the snout of the animal to sort of the middle of the skull in the fossils that we found in the rock layers that are above those, and of course a modern day whale or something that is more modern, having the blowhole kind of at the top of the skull. And so again, there's all kinds of transitions that we can see in the fossils, and that's a really convincing thing for people when we are looking at the series of events that could have been the real events of the evolution of any organism. The second kind of main evidence that we have is anatomy. Take a look at these, the breakdown of the limbs of these creatures: the human, the cat, the whale, the bat. There's a big long bone, there's two long bones, and then there's some little bones, and then finger bones. And again, we know that because that's what our hand is. You look at a cat, and it looks kind of similar if you look at the anatomy there. If you look at a whale, since we're talking about whales here in our video, same kind of thing. Now they look different, but the arrangement and the number of bones even most often is most often the same. Okay, long bone, two long bones, little bones, and then these finger bones. And the bat, which we know to be also a mammal, again, same kind of arrangement of the bones there. So anatomy, comparative anatomy, gives us an idea that certain organisms could be related and therefore could share an ancestor that had that characteristic as well. And again, if we assume that the anatomy is showing us evolutionary relatedness, we can use that to draw diagrams that help us understand how certain things are related. For example, examining the anatomy of the bones of a panda bear is sort of the outgroup here from the chimpanzee, the human, and the gorilla, which have more similar anatomies of our hand bones. And so we can use that to sort of draw some conclusions and answer other questions, not just how did a certain species evolve, but how is that species related to another species that we know of through evolution. Our third main evidence for evolution is embryology. Embryos are, of course, the young developing organisms. And here you see a human fetus developing. This is on the right-hand side is also a human, but earlier on. The earlier on we look at an embryo, the more similar a lot of the embryos look. Let's look at some more examples of that. So seemingly unrelated animals. Here is, down here is the embryos of a chicken. Again, on the left-hand side are these slightly more developed embryos. And again, this does look like a chicken, and this looks like a human, and they definitely look different. But early on the right-hand side here, you see that the chicken embryo and the human embryo take on a slightly more similar form. They both look kind of alien, you know, but they are certainly the beginning forms of both of these organisms. And the more towards the beginning of the embryological development we get, the more similar these organisms look in their forms, at least. And so that clues us into that at the beginning of our development, there's a lot of things that we share about how things get set up, like the head region and the tail region and the middle part of our body. We share that with the way the embryo of the chicken, for example, gets set up as well. And again, birds and humans are distantly related, but our embryos show us that there may actually be some underlying similarities in the way that our bodies are built and the way that our bodies develop. Here's another example of that. This is some original research that was done in evolution. You see the fish, salamander, chicken, rabbit, and human. I mean, again, if you go way back in their development, you see their embryos look very, very similar. These are actually images that are overlaid on the actual embryological pictures themselves, but you can see that the embryos look so similar, again, leading to the conclusion that we share some kind of past, some ancestry in the way that our bodies actually develop. And our fourth piece of evidence here, our fourth and final piece of major evidence for biological evolution, is genetics, or DNA. DNA holds the genetic code for our cells and for the development of our bodies. And by comparing DNA from the cell of one organism to the DNA from the cells of another organism, we can see differences. And the assumption is that the more we share about our DNA, the more we share with our evolutionary past with whatever organism we're comparing with. This is kind of cool. There's some gene clusters both in insects and in humans that lead us to believe that, again, the way our bodies get set up with the instructions from the DNA is very, very similar. And that's going a little bit above and beyond the degree of our tutorial here, but it's very interesting to know that we share genes with the insect, and it's not just any genes, they're genes that allow us to set up our bodies. And so again, the way a body of an insect is set up and the way that the body of a human or a mammal is set up has a lot of similarity. So let's take a look at more genetics evidence here. Oops, let's go back. So when we sequence DNA, we get the genetic sequence. So the A, T, C's, and G's, those are the nucleotides. Those are the code letters that make up the instructions in our DNA. And again, here's a mouse gene and a fly gene, and they are the same gene. I don't know what this gene is, but it's something that the two organisms share, a characteristic that they share. Maybe it's the gene that helps set up bones or eyes or something like that, since flies and mouse both have eyes, for example. Maybe that's what this is. But if we look at the same type of gene from the organism, we see similarities. So the genetic code is the same for a lot of these things, and there are some places where they are different. And where they're different, that tells us that something has changed over time. And of course, the mouse is you can think of as a slightly more evolved organism than the fly, not necessarily, but they share an ancestry, but they've both changed since they shared that ancestry. And so you can see here that there's a 76% similarity in these sequences. Okay, so let's review here at the end of the video the four main pieces of evidence for biological evolution. The first, of course, is fossils. We don't have fossils for everything, but the fossils that we do have help us place forms of organisms in time. Again, with the help of our geology, rock layers, we can place them in relative time to each other so we can see transitions over time. And of course, that's at the heart of evolution, the change in organisms over time. Anatomy helps us compare relatedness. You can compare the relatedness of organisms by simply looking at their anatomy, and sometimes the deeper you go, the more similarities you find. For example, with bone anatomy, we use as an example here in the video, it shows a lot of relatedness among certain groups of organisms. The third major piece of evidence is embryology. Again, the early development of every type of, for example, animal, at least that's the research that's been done, shows us that we may share an ancestry because we share the way that our young embryos get set up, whether it's you're comparing mammals and birds or reptiles and mammals, whatever it is, we see a lot of embryological similarity when we examine those very, very young embryos. And the last, of course, is DNA. DNA can be very powerful. It is not the end-all answer to evolution, but it certainly gives us a lot of information. In fact, it's sort of turned a lot of our hypotheses on their heads. It turns out that we share a lot more DNA similarity with fungi than we do with plants. That wasn't necessarily the thought a long time ago, but that's what DNA tells us. By examining the genetic code, the assumption is that the more genetic code we share with an organism, the more related we are to that organism, and the more close in history we share an ancestor with that organism. And that helps us place together the story of evolution of the organisms that we are comparing. So there you go. That's the evidence for evolution, and that is the end of our video.